I am Faith Mangope. Now, many matrics from the class of 2018 currently find themselves in the fortunate positions of having performed better than anticipated in their National Senior Certificate Examination, achieving a bachelor's pass and qualifying for higher education access. But while they're now in a position to apply for further study, these prospective students need to ensure that they do their homework before signing up with institutions still accepting applications for study in 2019. So let's get you more on this. We're joined by Kamini Naidu, who's the Senior Head of Program at the Independent Institute of Education. Kamini, thanks a lot for joining us this evening on Newsnight.
Thank you for having me.
Now, we have this conversation every single year about students or prospective students not being sort of enticed by some of these fly-by-night institutions. Maybe the question is, why does the problem persist? It's 2018. One would think that they would be afraid, or institutions that are fraud would be afraid of actually opening up simply because people are wiser, but that's not the case, hey?
I think it's a really exciting time for students. So they want to start this journey of independence and acquiring new knowledge through their qualifications. And I think a lot of the times they're blinded by that excitement and just accept the qualifications that seem extremely interesting and something new. And that's why it's so important for them to do their research in order to understand more about those institutions.
When we're talking about research, what kind of research? You know, and the reason why is because when I was in university, donkey years ago, one would have the prospective universities, or the universities that are deemed to have internationally recognized qualifications, so to say, and those would be your guiding principles in terms of this is where I need to apply. Is it still the case in this time? Because a lot of private institutions are claiming to have internationally recognizable any form of qualifications.
I think, you know, there are many ways to do research, and you could go onto the internet and check the status of that educational institution or the qualification. All tertiary institutions, they have to be registered by the Department of Higher Education and Training, and then they need to be accredited by the CHE, which is the Council of Higher Education. Okay. So even if students or prospective students go onto the SACWA website, which is the South African Qualifications Authority, and look for the ID, that would be able to tell them if a qualification is accredited and is registered, and that they are going to walk out with an accredited qualification.
And when we're talking about an accredited qualification, and it's one thing to have an accredited qualification, but it's another thing to ensure that your qualification, and this is going to be a talking point now for documenters, that the qualification gets you some form of access to even a job interview. Because ultimately the reason why we go to school is so that we can get a qualification that is going to open the doors for us to get potential employment. So then how then do you start differentiating or even assisting students to differentiate that there's one thing between a qualification, there's another thing with the qualification that actually gets into the door of a potential employer?
Well, that's also important for students to be able to try and communicate with career centers at the various campuses or their chosen institution and get the conversation going about, so if I get this qualification, what job do I get? So, for example, there are many students that want to be a journalist, and the unrealistic expectation is that they would walk into a job that involves glamorous travel and interviewing high-profile celebrities. And that is not the reality. So speak to people that are doing the job, speak to the career centers, the academic advisors that will give you insight into what kind of jobs this qualification will provide access to.
You know, not to sound like a pessimist, but unfortunately, given where the statistics are pointing, we've got a lot of young people that are currently in institutions that are not recognized, you know, and that will not give them that relevant qualification. If a student finds themselves in that predicament where you understand that you've been attending a certain institution maybe for the entire year of 2018, and now you realize, shucks, man, that was a big mistake. Is there, number one, any way of getting your money back? Or number two, any way of reporting such an institution? Or number three, getting some form of retribution as a result of being swindled, should I say, swindled of your money?
There are ways. I mean, they could use social media as a starting point and get some insight from previous students if they had also been at the same institution and faced the same circumstances. But they could also report them to the Council of Higher Education. And they would be able to provide some insight into whether this is a credible institution, or, you know, were there some conditions that needed to be met in order for this institution to be credible, and it was not met. But start doing your homework now. If you feel that way, do not stay there and just...
But can I get my money back if I happen to find myself in such an institution? And I know sometimes we have to take accountability, I think, even as young people, that sometimes it's because we don't do enough research, right?
Yes.
But if you find yourself in a situation where you've been in a fraudulent institution, your qualification is not going to be worth anything should you finish the 3 years in it. Are you able to get something out of it? At least your money back, or even your registration back, something.
I think that's why it's important for them to read the fine print.
Yeah.
I cannot answer that question, you know, but I can provide my opinion, is to read the small print, where if that happens, you have your contract to say that the institution was found to be not accredited, and therefore you are entitled or you have a right to get that money back.
And then in terms of just the credible institutions that are to the best of one's ability, in other words, when you get into that institution after spending your 3 years or your 4 years or 7 years acquiring that degree and studying long and hard, that there is something to show for it, at least even if it's on paper, which institutions would you say, or is there a guideline really for institutions that young people should be tackling and should be looking at and saying, this is what I want to be affiliated with, or this is an institution that can give me the outcome, and that outcome is to make sure that when I'm done with this, I'm employable?
Well, there are two ways of looking at it. The first one is to consider whether you would want to go to a public university or a private university.
So what would you recommend? And it's so great that we're having these conversations, because, I mean, on the private side, one would say that be careful, because sometimes it's more expensive, right? But on the public side of it, you know, there's that, they've got a track record, so to say. So what would you recommend?
Well, the public universities are much larger, so the class numbers are big. With the private universities, you are paying for the smaller classes, the more one-on-one interaction, the facilities, and the niche market, which are things like degrees in gaming, how to create a game.
Fourth industrial revolution, right there, because we need to keep in track with the trends, right?
And marketing, branding and marketing, digital marketing. And those are more likely to be offered by the private institutions.
And then I've got another question that follows from that one before we wrap up this conversation. We're talking about the private institutions that offer the variety, really, and also are ahead of the curve in terms of getting people into the door of the right opportunities in line with where we're moving as a country. So fourth industrial revolution comes into question. However, the very same employers that must sit down with you and the recruitment agencies that must sit down with you, do they even recognize those very same institutions? Because it's the chicken and the egg. Sometimes the employers themselves go, we don't really recognize students from this because we like students from X or X university, so to say. So then how do you mitigate that?
Well, look, I think you will always have certain industries that will be drawn towards students from certain institutions. And it does take a lot to change that mindset. So what we do in our work integrated programs is to allow students and encourage students to become part of that workplace where our brand of institutions are then, their names are more recognized through the work that students do. And we do hope that it's a good performance by students. So it's about the students. It's also about the type of qualifications that the niche markets or the niche universities do offer. And we do hope that industry can see that, wow, this qualification is not offered by any other institution. I will remember that institution.
Well, we definitely hope that this lands on the right ears this evening. Thanks a lot for joining us, Carmen, and giving us insight in just in terms of how should students get themselves so ready for this year, 2019, and how to avoid, problems such as being in a fraudulent institution or fake institution for that matter, and finding yourself too late that you actually cannot leave there. So, Carmen, thanks a lot for joining us this morning, giving us